Before I get started, I just want to thank our sponsors this morning to help bring this important discussion forward today. And that's our sponsor is Innovative Medicines Canada, and we'll be hearing a little bit more from them in a little bit. But for those who haven't attended before, this is indeed a live journalism event. And for what a live journalism event is, there's a couple of nuanced caveats that you should understand, both people in the room, people watching us on Facebook, and of course our panelists. A live journalism event, first of all, it means that everything that's said today is on record. So just forewarning everybody, just be heads up. And because it's on record, one of the things that we do is we want to encourage our audiences to be able to actually participate. So you in the room, as well as our live viewing audience, to actually engage in this discussion, because it isn't just about the panelists that we are going to hear from. We want to hear your feedback and information. We use a different approach for that. We use a technology called Slido.com. So this is the interactive portion of this session. We're going to encourage you and to our viewers at home to actually pull out your mobile phones, second screens, computers, and actually log on to www.slido.com. That's www.slido.com. And you can see you're going to be invited to input a hashtag to get started. And we're going to use the hashtag of IPOLHealthIn. You can see it on the screens around you. In addition to that, you're going to be able to ask questions and show and be able to engage by asking questions in 160 characters or fewer, okay? So by asking questions, what you can do is you're going to be able to see the list of questions, and at the same time, you're going to be able to turn around and then vote on those questions and vote them up. So the ones with the highest votes will end up at the top of the queue. The ones with the top of the queue will be the ones that the moderator will ask of the panelists. So let me just go ahead here and start with a polling question to see as people are pulling it up. And I think the poll is up now. You can see, so we're going to try this out. So of the $10 billion Ottawa spends each year on science and technology, how much is directed to research and labs across Canada? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? Is it 30%? How much is it? And the answer, of course, you can see we've got a good group of people participating right off the bat. The answer, of course, Jackie is going to address that a little later on in her, so I'm happy to see that the technology is working. So with that, let me, without further ado, everybody can see how this is going to work today. We're going to be able to ask these questions. You're going to be able to participate with Twitter. Jackie's going to encourage you to do so. The panelists will be able to respond to those questions throughout. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Pamela Freilich, the President of Innovative Medicines Canada, to come and say a few words. Pamela?
Thank you, Andrew. Merci à tous d'être ici aujourd'hui, and thank you for that reminder that this is live. Just really delighted to be here and to be part of this event, Innovative Medicines Canada. So proud to be able to support these sorts of dialogues. And I think in particular at a time when we are so focused on cost and sustainability, as we should be, we forget a little bit of the excitement of the innovative side of this wonderful world that we work in. And so to have this type of a panel, the experts to inspire us, to excite us, I think is just a wonderful way to press pause for a few moments on the heavy lifting around price and sustainability. The health and biosciences sector in Canada is one of incredible promise. It's a sector that makes invaluable contributions, and not only to the economy, but also to the health of Canadians. When I think of innovation in this sector, I often think of the undeniable progress that's occurred in revolutionizing treatment. Think of the ability we now have to manage HIV for a lifetime, to actually cure diseases like hepatitis C, the strides being made in personalized medicine and immunotherapies to treat cancer. And many of these very transformative innovations can be traced back to the remarkable work being done right here in Canada. Canada has produced globally recognized researchers, dynamic partnerships across academia, research institutes, industry, and an advantageous business environment. At the same time, however, there are always challenges facing the sector. In his report of the Economic Advisory Council, Dominic Barton, another proud Canadian, acknowledged that while the life sciences sector is an economic driver in Canada, there's a recognized need for sector-specific solutions to drive competitiveness. Barton also noted that while this sector is promising with the innovation it delivers, it's often passed over in favor of other sectors in terms of investments. Added to this challenge is the higher regulatory burden this sector faces compared to others. Barton's words, not mine. In his recent report, Dr. David Naylor identified challenges to fundamental science in Canada and ensuring that the next generation of scientific researchers can flourish and become research leaders in this country and on the world stage. Despite our many strengths, the Naylor report noted underfunding, and we just noted that in the poll, and weak coordination is limiting the effectiveness of Canada's research ecosystem and eroding our research competitiveness. Now, Budget 2017 sent a very strong signal that this government is serious about stimulating innovation in the health and biosciences sector. We're seeing this unfold day by day. Just recently, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Navdeep Bains, announced this government's supercluster initiative to jumpstart innovation in several targeted high-growth sectors, including health and biosciences. These commitments underscore the promise for the future of the health and biosciences sector in Canada. It's one of the few sectors, and I've mentioned this already, I'll underline it again, it's able to generate better health for the population while also being an economic driver. So what does the future look like? How can we ensure Canada is a leader in science and innovation? There are opportunities for improvement across the entire innovation chain. We need to better support our young researchers, help newly emerging companies to expand, and perhaps, most important of all, ensure that Canadian discoveries make it to commercialization so patients can benefit from the research happening in this country. We have 4 very thoughtful and provocative panelists here today who will delve into these issues and offer us some possible solutions to improve the innovation continuum in Canada. I want to thank each of you, and Jacqueline, of course, for being here today and sharing in what I believe will be an inspiring dialogue. And with that, I turn over to Jacqueline. Thank you so much. Merci.
Pamela, thank you. Thank you all who are attending this morning. It's great to have everyone in this packed room, and very glad you could take the time to join us this morning. Thank you to all who are joining us via live stream as well. And thank you for all our esteemed panelists who are here with me. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, very much looking forward to the discussion, which really I think, well, in an industry-wide view, because of the vast and varied background that each of you bring as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Joining us this morning, we have Dr. John Bergeron, Professor of Medicine at McGill University. Thanks for joining us, John. We have Gordon McCauley, President at the CDRD, the Centre for Drug Research and Development, based in BC. Frank Bevero, CEO of Montreal In Vivo, joining us. Frank, good to see you. And Karen Grieve-Young is Vice President of Corporate Development and Partnership at Mars, based in Toronto. So thank you all for joining us. As we get underway, as Andrew just mentioned, this is interactive, and we want all of you to participate as well. And it does add to a full and rich conversation. So some of you are already using Slido. So just again, if you haven't submitted a question, I'll give you that again. It's www.slido.com, and the hashtag is IPOL-HealthIn. IPOL, health, and then INN for innovation. So think about what you might want to put to our panelists, and we'll get to that as well. So for our panelists, as we get underway, about 5 minutes, just as I throw a quick question your way to really maybe set the scene, introductory thoughts, remarks, and to help us frame where we're going to go with today's discussion as well. So I've just been handed a note. This has nothing to do with any kind of testimony, I just want to say. We have a video presentation that we'd like to begin with before our actual conversation begins. So let's start with that, and this will frame some of the discussion that we're about to get underway.
Within about a 1.5 kilometer radius of where we're standing right now, we have over $1.5 billion of research going on in the life sciences field every year.
So we are in the Max Bell building of the Toronto General Research Institute, which is affiliated with the University Health Network. The work that we do here is actually focused on cardiac repair and end-stage heart failure. We are actually looking at using animal models and disease modeling in a dish to try to come up with new treatments for this very devastating disease.
A couple of decades ago, if you were diagnosed with breast cancer, your chances of hitting that 5-year gold standard of good living was very, very low. Today it's at 88%. We thought for years that Hep C was incurable. There's now medication that cures it. We never would have believed that 5 years ago.
I think we've always been a leader in healthcare research and development and life sciences innovation. Hospice is a Canadian term. It started here. Insulin was discovered across the street. What we haven't been known for is actually then commercializing these discoveries and taking them globally.
We have a $52 billion business that runs our healthcare system in Ontario, and we should be leveraging the massive state investment in healthcare as an economic driver.
The reality is that health is expensive. We need to invest more and smarter in all of it, and part of that is by getting all of the different players involved in investing together.
We have money, a lot of money that's going into the system, so we have to ask ourselves the question, are we using it efficiently? I would say in the pharma industry, it's shocking how many new innovations are on the cusp of being made available, and yet we're held back.
We have between 800 and 1,000 startups in health technology that export their goods and services in healthcare around the world, but they don't grow as a result of this big $52 billion end user, the Ontario healthcare system. They kind of grow in spite of it.
If you think about innovation, there's the invention side, creating the companies. There's the adoption side, actually getting those innovations to the people who need them.
It's creating this ecosystem where people can collaborate, they can bring investors in, they can bring in mentorships, they can bring in support from the government. All those things come together to create great opportunities. Think about AI, artificial intelligence. We are the leaders in the world. What can AI do to the life science industry? I think it's only up to the imagination, and we're harnessing that now.
Can we get governments to work innovatively and collegially together for the betterment of all Canadians?
How do you enable and empower people to take control of their own health?
How do we keep the researchers in this country?
It is an opportunity for us to show companies around the world that we're open for business. We really have a diversity here, we have lower taxes, we have a safe environment to work in. Those are all things that attract CEOs from around the world.
It's another great opportunity in Canada to reverse the brain drain and change it into a brain gain. You will have people living and working and playing and investing and raising families in these cities, provinces in this country for the next 100 years.
So Karen and Pamela, who took part in that, thank you, and good to see you on the screen as well as in person, and thank you for your participation in that. So that really helps frame our discussion. There's a lot of money, as we heard, going into the life science sector, but what can we do better? How can we extract more from those dollars going in? And Pamela referenced in her opening remarks the Naylor report, which does ask the government to increase funding from $3.5 billion to $4.8 billion, but also speaks to how do we keep researchers in this country? And that's a big question. So, I think some of the siloed research system, that was the terminology that was referenced in the report, weakly coordinated, inconsistently evaluated, was some of what Dr. Naylor said is happening within that funding system. And so we know there's an advisory council that's going to be looking at that and some sort of reform down the road. So let's start with research. Dr. Bergeron, let's start with you because this is something that's near and dear to your heart. We know that. How do we keep these young researchers in this country?
So thank you and welcome. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my gratitude for being invited to this panel, and especially because of these other folks here. They're at the apex of what I like to call the health innovation pyramid in their delivery of medicines and applications to the patient and the general public. Now, the health innovation pyramid, as I see it, rests on a base of discovery research, and I'm at that base, and that's what I'd like to discuss. So, there's a distinction between discovery and innovation. It's pretty simple. Discovery is finding something for the first time, and innovation is creating value for these discoveries. Now, David Naylor, the past president of the University of Toronto, best articulated the link between discovery and innovation because he's actually written 2 reports. The first report was submitted in July 2015 to the previous government on health innovation. The second report we've already discussed was presented to the Minister of Science just this April on discovery, on fundamental science. Now, the folks that have been the hardest hit over the past few years has been our young, talented discovery researcher. It's young folks that make discoveries. And right now, as I see things across the country, this young talent is no longer choosing discovery research in health, at least in Canada, as a viable career choice. But there's a solution. And this solution's already been implemented in Europe, exactly to address some of the issues that were raised today. And recently, in a newly opened institute in London, in the United Kingdom, the Crick Institute, targeted specifically to the young discovery researcher. Now, these folks in this model are brought together, the discovery researcher, for 10 to 12 years, and in the Canadian model, we could do exactly the same thing with a new institute. The Canadian model, as I see it, would have an equal representation of men and women investigators, and I'll tell you why in a moment. During their tenure at this institute, of course, they would be making their discoveries in this intense environment, but if we had on the board of directors folks like this who would be able to, who have a track record in drug discovery and applications, then these folks, these discovery researchers would be able to turn these around, learn how to turn them around for applications. Just as in the European and the UK model, after their 10 to 12-year stint, these folks would go out and they would populate our universities, our research institutes. They would create biotech, and who knows, they could even bring back big pharma preclinical research back to Canada, which is gone now. So for our 150th year celebration, could we implement the Naylor Report, but in addition, provide a new mechanism such that Canada would be the magnet for the most talented young investigators to thrive, and especially women scientists. And I'll tell you why women scientists, because already women make up the majority of research trainees in labs in discovery research in health in Canada. It could be that this would provide us with the internationally competitive edge that would assure that we have a base of discovery research which is essential to the foundation of this health innovation pyramid for the future. Thank you.
John, thank you. And thank you for bringing it back to what lies at the core of this. And it all starts with great fundamental research, right? And then we build from there. So Gordon, to that point, talk to us about what you do at the Center for Drug Research and Development, specifically in terms of the investment side, collaboration side, and how you are able to take research, translate it into something viable on the commercial market, right?
Absolutely. So let's, if I can, my perspective, I've been a venture capitalist and a CEO in this space for 20 plus years. I've raised and deployed hundreds of millions of dollars from literally all over the world. I've sat in the boards of companies all over North America. I've run a lab in Israel. I'm the first Canadian that was appointed to the board of BIO, the global voice of biotechnology. I tell you that not to brag, but just to give you the perspective. Well, the brag's kind of fun.
Yeah, brag a little.
But just to give you a sense of the perspective is, it's an incredibly important issue from whatever perspective you look at it. And I think it's really important that this discussion isn't about health innovation per se, but it's health innovation scale up. And how do we scale up in commercial terms? We're 0.5% of the world's population and 5% of the innovative output. So that's a 10x multiplier. That's great. We are, depending on which metric you choose, number 1 or number 2 in the world in starting up companies. That sounds great, but it's not necessarily not necessarily the case, because we are also the only advanced pharma market in the world without our own anchor biotechnology company, defined as a company with $1 billion in sales or better. Classically, what we do is we develop products to human proof of concept or maybe to commercial scale, and then we sell them off somewhere else. And when that happens, what people, venture capitalists like I have been telling you, well, that's okay because the capital gets redeployed, which is sort of true, except that capital is remarkably mobile and can go anywhere and can invest in anything. And frankly, more important than the capital, in my view, is that the jobs go away and the expertise and the experience created in that development journey go somewhere else. It's kind of what my dad would have called confusing activity for achievement. So solving that problem, kind of turning Canada's innovation activity into innovation achievement, is why our organization, the Centre for Drug Research and Development, CDRD, exists. We are Canada's national drug development centre. Our vision is to see a Canadian life sciences ecosystem leading the world, and we do that three ways, and I am eventually coming around to answering your question.
Oh, I know you are.
We do that three ways. First of all, we're a global bridge that brings together and translates discoveries from the academic community, the biotech community, into novel products. Secondly, we build sustainable partnerships and bring together all of the key players, biotech, academia, pharma companies, and capital. And thirdly, to your point, we uniquely train the next generation of highly qualified personnel, which is incredibly important. At a practical level, we're 100 people, 70% of whom are scientists, 60%, by the way, happen to be women. It's also the case that we have 17 different native languages spoken within our group. So it's a beautiful representation of Canada. We have in one location all of the requisite drug development requirements that you need to build out facilities. We have alliances across the country with our colleagues at Mars and the Centre for Regenerative Medicine in Toronto, with the Ottawa Health Research Institute, with the Montreal Neurological Institute, with Dalhousie. We really take advantage of the expertise across the country and provide our expertise in translating those things. We've also brought together pharma into this equation because it's incredibly important, and they provided millions of dollars of innovation funds for us to bring these discoveries forward. We've worked with a couple of thousand researchers. We've worked with 30 or 40 Canadian biotech companies, and guess what? We know the model works. We have spun out 7 companies that have been scaled up to attract $60 million in seed capital. They've further attracted hundreds of millions of dollars of follow-on capital. We've helped create and maintain spin-out jobs all over the country. Recently, our largest partner, Zymeworks, launched the largest IPO in eons on the Toronto and New York Stock Exchange in this space. And we're going to keep moving forward. So the point of all this is that we need to bring those folks together. We need to give them the expertise. We need to give them the unique training that is required. We need to provide the facilities and go deeper and at greater scale. And that's the essence of what we try and do.
And so, just to be clear, so it's not like this system, right, doesn't produce wins. We have a lot of wins. I know you could go on at length and highlight many more. But, you know, to the point of the Naylor report, we can do better, right? And we can distribute some of those monies and attract more researchers and, you know, develop that base on up more effectively. So this is what we're going to focus on. But there are wins. You've noted some of them, Gordon. Frank as well, with Montreal in Vivo. You have wins. I'm sure you also have challenges, though, within this existing framework and system as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. Actually, let me give you just a few words before we start on the ecosystem, Montreal ecosystem for life sciences, and I feel compelled to do so after watching that great video that talked just about Toronto.
It was only because we filmed it in Toronto. Yes,
no, it's all right.
Yes.
Just kidding here. Well, in a few words, few stats. The ecosystem in Montreal, it's in life sciences. This is approximately 600 organizations, 450 companies, and 150 public research groups. That's 40,000 people working in that space in Montreal. And Montreal is basically 80% of the Quebec activity in terms of life sciences. And our ecosystem, our industry generates outputs. It's $5.6 billion in terms of GDP. That's 1.6% contribution to the Quebec GDP. So that's quite significant. But when I look at our industry, this is an industry made of relatively small companies. 94% of them have less than 200 employees. The average number of employees per company is 51. And that includes the large pharmaceutical companies we have in Montreal. So that means we have clearly something that we have to scale up, if I can use that word. So overall, the ecosystem in Montreal and in Quebec ranks number 10 in North America. So not so bad, but not great. We still have to make efforts to try to reach maybe the top 5. And we're working on that closely. So what we do at Montreal in Vivo, basically, we're an economic development group. This is really our mission, our mandate. What we want to do is to ensure we have growth for the organization in the ecosystem. We want to make sure that they have the best possible competitiveness in that global economy, in that global environment. So we do so by federating pretty much the resources and the energies and the goodwill of all the actors of the ecosystem. Basically, we do studies. We try to analyze as best as possible our local and international environment. We do projects, and I'll get back to that in a few seconds. We organize different types of events, and we support as well our SMEs to help them grow. So in terms of successes, the wins, during the different activities we did in the past 10 years, we're turning 10-year-old this year, actually.
Congratulations.
Thank you. A big event on October 18 to celebrate that. One of the wins I like to mention is CQDM, Consortium Québécois pour la découverte du médicament. We were at the origin of that project, and that's, I think, one of the key elements and one of the key distinctive advantages of life sciences in Canada and in Quebec is the ability to put organizations very different to work together. And that's our job. We put them, in a room around the table, and we kind of make them work together. CQDM was, I think, the first example of that, because that's a public-private consortium of companies, pharma companies that are competitors in the field, but that agreed to jointly finance drug discovery technologies for the benefit of all of them. And I think that was a very important success for Quebec and for Montreal in life sciences. And we can kind of do and use the same model for later stage project with NeoMed. NeoMed is another very good example of, it was turning a bad news into a good news, because that's how you use the opportunity of, we had AstraZeneca R&D center closing down, and we transformed that into a very, very successful hub for biotechs, CROs, research groups that work together. And today there are more people working at NeoMed, which is located in the former AstraZeneca R&D center than when AstraZeneca was there. So it's a great win, I think, for us. And also, it's also convincing and helping our governments to understand that they have to keep investing in life sciences. An example is personalized medicine. A few years back, we had this great initiative in personalized medicine, and we convinced the government to invest money into that initiative. And there is this project called PMPC now that is coming to an end, and that has generated, again, a lot of good research, and again, in collaboration between public research groups and private sector. So I think that's really something we should continue to push. And we have, I think, a good understanding now and a good response from our governments. When I look at the very, very recent strategy for life sciences in Quebec. That's quite impressive, I think, for a government well, yes, there is money in the strategy, of course, that's always good, but there's also a vision, there's an ambition, and that's something that we need to have as Canadians, as Quebecers. We have to have an ambition. We don't have to be afraid of setting high goals and trying to reach those goals, and that's why we get into the
Money's
with
important, but the vision is critical, right?
Exactly.
So thank you for those comments, and to push forward, some of what Gordon mentioned about, the importance of scaling up, right, and growing, and keeping that investment here, not only with researchers, but, with the businesses as we scale them up as well, and then that continues to pay dividends down the line. So Karen, I'm sensing Frank really wanted to be in the video. Frank, next video? Next time we'll get you in there. So we saw some of the points that you made, and I don't know in the video as well, but to pick up to the point that Frank made in terms of, the importance of scale-ups, I mean, you do this at Mars, of course.
Yeah.
Can you broaden some of what Frank mentioned? Collaboration is the future. This is where we need to go.
It is, and I think you'll hear some familiar themes from me because it'll sound like what you've been hearing. I think collaboration, having a deep Canadian root system, and actually thinking beyond the research and discovery to the commercialization of these discoveries so that they get to patients. I mean, that's, I think, ultimately what we're talking about in healthcare. Similarly, in age, Mars started about just over 10 years ago, and the whole idea was how do we commercialize the research and development coming out of this region. Today, we work with and support over 1,000 startups, and we're cross-sector, and I think that's a differentiator for us. It's an important part of our model. So we have about 300 startups we support in health and life sciences, and then we also work with about actually closer to 900 in clean technologies, work and learning, finance and commerce. And that convergence actually is what spurns, or what sparks a lot of research and discovery and commercial opportunities. I think the root system is important, and we've heard a lot about that. That's a lot of what CDRD is doing. That's a lot of what you're doing at Invivo. That's a lot of what the Mars Center is meant to do. We're 1.5 million square feet, and we're a diverse community of hospital and university researchers. We have 11 venture capital firms within the center. We have 100 of the 1,000 startups we work with in the center, many of whom are using our lab incubators as their way to get out of the university setting. We have multinational companies, including Johnson & Johnson's first J-Labs accelerator outside of the US, which is then home to startups and exposes them to multinationals. And increasingly, what we're seeing, and we heard a little bit about personalized medicine and about artificial intelligence, we're seeing the opportunity to create these deep roots and get centers of excellence in key areas. Those are two that we work closely on. You heard a little bit about the Center for Commercialization of Regenerative Medicine. They have a new stem cell production and manufacturing facility, which has in turn drawn a company called Blue Rock Therapeutics, co-invested by Bayer and Versant Ventures. And Versant said, we go where the science is. Right now, the science is in Canada. And they invested $225 billion US, more than $225 billion Canadian, in the second largest biotech Series A financing. Sorry?
Million.
Sorry, millions, not billions. Thank you.
That's
important clarification.
That's coming.
That would have been quite extraordinary. $225 million US. It's not a whole order.
Still incredible.
It's still incredible. Thank you. In Blue Rock Therapeutics, which is locating in Canada at the Mars Center, so that it can be by CCRM and the UHN researchers. So I think getting the root system so that we can attract that kind of investment. The Vector Institute, which the federal, provincial governments and corporations invested in around AI, is a really important draw for keeping our. It's I think both an attraction and also again having deep roots to keep and retain our AI researchers in Canada, and actually run by one of the associated initiatives is run by a woman, Raquel Urchasal is her surname, who was one of the leading U of T researchers in AI working on autonomous vehicles. So getting that, and then there are startups like Deep Genomics and DNA Stack who are working in that AI space. So that convergence is a really important thing. And then we've got to get to scale. So these big financings are really important, and those are great. We also have to work on the adoption side, and I think there's a lot of exciting work happening in terms of opening the systems and markets to innovation. One that we've worked on is the Excite initiative, which now has similar models starting throughout Canada, but it's basically taking health technology assessment into the pre-market to and connecting private, public, connecting all of the players to help the best health technologies actually get to market. And the first technology to go to, called Brezo DX, is a home sleep apnea diagnostic, so that you don't have to go to a sleep lab and wait for access to a sleep lab to be diagnosed with sleep apnea. That technology is now adopted and available to Ontario patients. That's a huge win. It took 5 years to get from starting the study to having that win. Healthcare takes a long time. So we need innovation. We need all of the players coming together. We need work inside the lab and outside of the lab in order to get the best technologies to patients. And I think we can create a lot of money for Canada in the meantime.
Well, and so what we've heard already is there are a lot of wins through collaborative efforts that are only going to grow. And we know this, taking it back to the Naylor report, again, this is, the direction that we need to all go. But let me just toss out the general question for all of you. Just the biggest hurdle right now that you see, what is it, just in one word?
Discovery research.
Yeah, Gordon?
I'd say C-level leadership within companies.
Okay.
I'd say adoption of the innovations.
Yeah.
I would say actually capital as well, adoption, but also capital and Canadian capital.
Okay, so,
Yeah,
these
I
are, I don't want to say huge obstacles, but these are large-scale challenges. Where do we start? Do we go to the labs and accelerators and those who are already engaged in these collaborative efforts and say, okay, well, let's take what works, let's move that forward? Are we already doing that? The funding seems to be there clearly for that. The government's recognized that, yes. So let's take what works, let's move that forward. That in turn will attract more researchers. What about clinical trials? Isn't that at the core as well? If we get more clinical trials, don't we attract the better research as well? Or not necessarily so?
Certainly I do. I mean, so to your questions, I think the collaboration is at the core of who Canadians are. It was I was in a discussion last week with Chris Austin, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health Institute and Translational Research in the US. So they spend a couple of $1 billion a year in this effort. And we had a really interesting discussion about how the scale-up challenges that kind of reflect the classic stereotypes of the countries, right? Canadians, we're collaborative, we work together, we do all this sort of stuff, which is tremendous. And we do. I mean, all of our organizations collaborate together effectively, and I think you're seeing on the stage, you're seeing those kind of programs finding ways to work together. The challenge is now, how do we get kind of commercially minded and frankly a little more bloody minded about really seizing that competitive market opportunity, and that is the scale-up challenge. That's why I agree completely. I think capital is incredibly important, and if I'd chosen to, I would have said capital and C-level people, because I think capital is incredibly important. I think it's interesting that we need to make sure that we train those C-level people. We do I think a really good job of training scientists to be more commercially minded. I think we also have to focus on training business people to be more scientifically minded, because that's a really important symbiosis.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? And then I'm going to be taking some of the questions that all of you have submitted, so I'm looking forward to that as well. Go
Well, I
ahead.
think building on that, I think that's where the root system comes in. Without having an anchor pharma company in Canada, we don't have that one huge multinational company that has its leaders populating other smaller and mid-sized companies throughout Canada. So we have to get that talent from somewhere, and the more we have several centers across the country that have critical mass of growing, hopefully scaling pharma and other health companies, we'll start getting there, but that's a big challenge.
Yeah. One of the questions I saw there that I think is really important is there was a question about, has the train left the station on creating a Canadian anchor? And the answer is absolutely not. There are spectacular organizations in this country. In Vancouver, Stem Cell is the largest biotech company in the country with 1,000 employees. They trade all over the world. They were at an event here earlier this week where they're going to do $160 million of revenue 90 some odd % of it outside of Canada. They're a spectacular example of what we can do. And in each of the key biotech hubs, I almost said cluster, each of the biotech clusters in Canada is a collection of half a dozen or 10 companies that are absolutely at the stage where they can break out and be that globally competitive anchor company.
Okay, so I'm going to get to a few of these questions. Still a lot of time if anyone wants to jump in and make a specific point, and I'm happy to do that. And I also want to get to some of what John mentioned earlier on and the model of that the UK brings, I think, within Europe, because they're doing a lot of innovative things. And so I really want to get to that as well. Can I ask a question? Then we'll delve into the answer. But what public policy barriers exist to improving innovative growth in medicines, from Anonymous? And just a note here, you can be anonymous. We welcome that. Sometimes people hesitate to ask a really great question because they don't want to put their name to it. So this is a good thing. We're all about, enriching the conversation. So we encourage this. So public policy barriers to improving innovative growth in medicine specifically.
So maybe I could start it off with the second question as well, which is how can Canada compete with the U.S., because I see them both intertwined.
They're tied in.
They're
right?
both intertwined.
Yeah.
And so the integrative growth in medicines, as I define it, is coming up with that blockbuster pipeline discovery, which is going to transform the world. We have them. You folks have been mentioning them, and you folks are at the top of this apex of being able to deliver. We generated discovery, and we have the head of discovery research here from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. You generated discovery, you folks can deliver, no question. So the question is getting the discovery, right? So we have in Montreal, the discovery of PCSK9 with the brother of the former Prime Minister, Michel Chrétien, right? They discovered it. It's a bio drug that's going to be targeted that will be the next generation statin, right? Big discovery. You folks would be able to launch this if that opportunity was there. So the link between the discovery and the opportunity had a gap, and it wasn't able to, they weren't able to capitalize on what you folks can offer. So there's some mechanism that's necessary. PCSK9, so we've had our top genomics researcher, Tom Hudson, good friend of mine, went from Montreal to Mars, and is now in AbbVie in California. How can we compete with the US? He was trained with Eric Lander, who created the Broad Institute. Tom was going to do the same here. He's at AbbVie. What is AbbVie's #1 drug right now? This is not a marketing thing. I'm just a basic researcher, right? It's a discovery made in Montreal and the University of California, and it's on a drug that was discovered by an investigator at McGill interested in figuring out how proteins are made selectively, and he stumbled across how they're made selectively in the brain, and this is a drug that's going to be used for memory. And Art Levinson is the head of the Calico, the head company that oversees AbbVie, and everybody's trying to buy AbbVie drugs, hoping this will be FDA approved. I have no idea, right? So we can deliver on these discoveries, and there's this gap between the discovery, which can take years to crystallize. The reason it's a discovery, it's so unexpected, right? Who would think that by studying fundamental mechanisms of how proteins are made, you would stumble on a drug that would enhance memory, right?
John, I'm going to
Sorry,
interrupt.
go ahead.
Just because I'm going to give
Yes.
Frank a chance to jump in as well.
I guess my answer to your question will be at the other end of the spectrum from what you just said, John, because for me, in terms of barriers, it's really adoption in the healthcare system. Why? Because we have technologies, we have innovations, we have, in some cases, a good example of scale-up. But it is still very complicated for a local company to get their products into the healthcare system.
There's a lot of regulatory hurdles, which are there for a good purpose, but sometimes it becomes a hindrance as well, right?
It is, and I think that in Canada we're kind of missing a great opportunity as well in terms of we have a single payer, at least in Quebec, that's the system we have. If we combine Quebec and Ontario in terms of the health data, this is bigger than the largest HMO in the US. So we should be able to use that as a unique competitive advantage to help companies, local companies, but also other companies to evaluate and measure the impact of their technologies into the healthcare system using having access to the data, so they can prove that yes, it does make sense to introduce that technology in the system because that's going to save time, cost, and lives. And that's something I think we're missing at this point.
Yeah, I mean, right now we make it hard for companies to make the decision to stay in Canada because we aren't first to adopt and we aren't giving them the money that they need and we don't necessarily have the talent that they need. So that they are consciously choosing to stay for other reasons, perhaps. We need to make it easy to make these companies that are coming out of Canadian Discovery make the decision to stay located here.
Right, so
And I'd also say that we need to spend as much energy. One of the things we do is spend as much energy on helping companies scale to a size that matter. We do probably half of our effort today is with biotech companies. We announced a transaction last week with Aqueous, a really effective Canadian specialty pharma company that has all sorts of strong sales today in Canada, all sorts of ideas about how they can develop new products, and the vision of our alliance with them is to be their research enterprise. So what we're doing is helping them scale up as an organization and build out their capacity to grow in Canada. So I think we've got, as I said earlier, we're really good at starting up companies. What we need to figure out how to do is to bring the capital and the people together to really scale those
So
companies.
can I bring it back to a point in the video that Bill Charnetsky, Ontario's Chief Health Innovation Strategist, made? And I recall him saying, well, you know, what happens in other countries perhaps is, and I think that's starting, and perhaps Karen, you can expand on this, in provinces like Ontario, where we're actually introducing some of those innovative technologies or medicines, you know, in cases where possible, and testing simultaneously. Is that possible? Because you're encouraging them to stay because you're showing a path forward, right?
Well, that's what Excite does. So the whole idea behind Excite was, rather than the traditional path where a company would first try to prove that it's safe and that it has safety and efficacy and go to Health Canada approval from a regulatory perspective, and then go to the health system and say, hey, I'm safe, will you adopt me? And the health system said, I didn't know you were coming, I wasn't looking for you, are you also cost effective? So what Excite does is it actually takes all of the health technology assessment into the pre-market to answer not only the questions of the regulator, but the questions of the health system. As part of that study, it makes the clinical study much more efficient, much
so it's
more
like
effective.
a pre-market track record almost? Could you know?
Exactly. It's getting that evidence in the pre-market. So that's a huge opportunity. It's being replicated worldwide, and Canada was the first to do it. And I would say, because health is done provincially, it started in Ontario, and to a decent extent, that first study stayed in Ontario, but it is being done across the country now.
Well, I think that's
Good
incredibly.
model, yeah.
I think it's incredibly important when you think about one of the revolutions that we're in the middle of right now around personalized medicine and regenerative medicines, which are really, instead of making drugs that are safe for the broadest population but might only work in a smaller population, to turn that around and look at the smaller population and really define a specialized product for that population. The challenge becomes, what does actually safety look like? And the regulatory hurdles are huge, so models like that can be quite effective.
If I can, I'm going to jump to another question. Forgive me, John. But has AI technology been used in the health sector yet? If so, what product or how many years away are we? Interesting, because of course, Vector Institute, which is going to be opening at the end of the year, I believe, right? So
Ivado is already open in Montreal.
Yes.
Ivado.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So good to know. So we're and we know AI already exists and is working in many applications, right? I mean, we all have it in our smartphones as well, Siri and all the marketing that's already available. But you know, I want to add to this question too, if I can, because I came across the Wellcome Trust Director of Innovation, Stephen Caddick, and this is a UK-based biomedical charity, and some of what they say to move the life science research and innovation forward, some of what they're putting forward, something called open innovation. And I want to ask all of you about that because it speaks to, I think, AI, technology, blockchain research. And it's this open, collaborative way of taking one piece of information that's great or one methodology that's worked and building and then sharing and adding and building and going forward this way. How feasible is that? And you know, is there a role for AI in some of that as well? Because we're heading into a brave new world in terms of collaborative efforts here, are we not?
So open science is a movement that's been going on for a long time. I think it's incredibly valuable at the early stage in allowing people to collaborate. The challenge becomes when you want to have an impact. And I'll give you an example. We were recently asked to visit with the Allen Brain Institute in Seattle. It's $1 billion developing tools to research the brain. It's really impressive. It's really incredible what they've built there, but it was all an open science environment. And the challenge they're having is that if you want to see an impact for that science, you need to have some sort of proprietary pathway. And they actually asked us to go there to help them understand, how do you do precisely that? How do you work in a collaborative environment, bring people together, but prospectively define an intellectual property pathway? And again, that's one of the things that our team does. We have a spectacular group that works closely with our researchers and our external partners to define that pathway ahead of time, because quite often we're working in either an open science environment or an environment where there's not yet intellectual property established.
Anyone else?
So open science begins with that discovery research. And it's through the discovery research that you have to have these multiple pipelines of discoveries that you folks can then transform. But as I see it, these pipelines are pretty well plugged right now. And I think my colleague here from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research suffers through this every single day, where they get an enormous number of applications, some of whom could transform our society. They're funding less than 10% of these folks, and that's why the Naylor report is saying, look, this pipeline, which is the base of all of this, is going to be turned off. How are we going to bring in these young folks for the next thing after the AI revolution, for the next thing after the personalized medicine? These are the young discoveries that have to be made available, and then that's what brings all the biotech here. Genentech, which was the first one to start the personalized medicine, was an academic, and again by the same person who created Calico, Levinson, was from the academic researchers who created this as a fabulous biotech company, now small big pharma with Roche. And its discoveries are now based on personalized medicine as a consequence of a business model developed through the discovery researchers. And this, in the States, goes through the NIH. The National Institutes of Health, the equivalent of our Canadian Institute for Health Research, has this $35 billion a year funding, and at least 30% of it is discoveries that immediately make it for the biotech and for the market. So we need to support the folks here in order to ensure that these discoveries continue, so as we can take advantage of what you folks have been providing for development and applications.
Well, we know, clearly, Dr. Naylor cited we need improvements to that, right? I mean, system can do a lot better in that regard.
Well, absolutely, and we don't know which ones. We don't know which basic research is going to really pay off. AI, everyone is now talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Well, CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, was funding it when it seemed pretty far from any commercial opportunity. And one of the reasons that Canada is now actually a global leader, hopefully still and continuing global leader in this space across the country, is because of researchers who were funded by CIFAR back when it seemed pretty low potential. And it's an example of the bridge, and now CIFAR is coordinating a lot of our national efforts around artificial intelligence. But
I'd also say, there's a great example, the Zymeworks example that I talked about earlier, which is a company that started out focused on so-called in silico kind of discovery, using AI and computer technology to try and advance the process before you actually go into the laboratory to really figure it out. So there's lots of good examples of that happening today.
Yeah.
Next question, how can Canada compete with the US in terms of medicine research? We somewhat touched on that, but anyone want to add to that a little bit?
I still want to continue adding to it because, no question. No, this is our big opportunity. David Naylor has produced these fantastic reports. If we don't implement these, history will look upon us and say, my goodness, you didn't have a better framework. The rest of the world is going to use this, right? We have to implement, we don't have to. We have to try to gather support for the folks to say that this is what we value in terms of what Canada wants to do for the future. In the case of the US, they've figured out the science game. No two ways about it. The amount of investment that they put into science is enormous. You look at the base of the pyramid, which is the National Institutes of Health, which is the closest to open science that we have globally, they'll fund anybody on the planet. They don't keep it to the Americans. You want to get a grant? I had a grant for decades from the NIH. They will fund you. They're 100% paid by the US taxpayer. They're saying, John, you're doing the best in this game. Of course you're going to get the funding, right? And that open science is what then leads to discoveries, because they benefit from the work that we publish, that for them to then generate their own discoveries, and it takes off. And they decided that's a calculation. The Howard Hughes Institute, this enormous gift of billions of dollars, which most of the Nobel Prize winners today are folks that are Howard Institute investigators, right? That's just the way it is. So how can we compete with the US? Adopt the Naylor report. We have a formula already there.
I think there's also a really unique opportunity at this moment in time that if we, I think the federal government's talking a fair bit about venture capital and how we effectively catalyze venture capital in the space and catalyze use programs like a similar version of the Small Business Investment Program in the U.S. I think that's our unique opportunity to really take advantage of what's going on in Canada today, which is extraordinary, as you're hearing here. But I think there's also a unique opportunity to attract people to Canada today, because I can tell you, as an organization that recruits people all the time, the comments you're hearing about people seeing applications in the U.S. are absolutely true. The scale of the applications we have today from the United States of people that are looking for a collaborative environment where they can actually do basic research, but also in a way that is ultimately commercially relevant and scale up. The scale of those applications is incredible.
So
Just maybe to complement on that, I think that bigger is not necessarily better. And when we compare to the US, that's maybe not the best thing to do, because I think we have to be smarter. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Israel, and I think that in terms of, they don't put as much money into the research as the US. Obviously, this is not the same scale, but their output is much greater. I think if you look at just the productivity of research, it's the innovation there. It's phenomenal, and this is the kind of model we should look into and trying to be much better at transforming those discoveries into innovation. That will make a huge difference.
And also, isn't multidisciplinary research part of that? So encouraging people who are engaged in one area to also perhaps delve into another, because that enriches the entire process as well, right? So we need collaborative efforts.
Yeah.
Clearly, we need more of a streamlining in terms of the actual doling out of dollars from the research system that is there, which Dr. Naylor has pointed to. Just quickly as we conclude, one quick point. The first thing that we need, I know what John's going to say.
Discovery research. It's the
Gordon?
foundation.
Gordon?
Scale up the exciting things that are happening in biotechnology today.
Yeah, and take the wins that we have, accelerate those, right? Frank?
Going back to what we said before, I think the having access to capital to the whole chain of financing is critical. The scaling up and adoption of innovation.
Karen?
Yeah, agreeing with everything, and I think the more we can give ourselves a really strong root system and all of those key ingredients, the more the companies that we scale from our excellent research will stay in Canada and grow from here.
And it's cyclical, and around and around it
local,
goes, right? The better the
Absolutely.
companies, the better the research, the more scientists.
Get a
that we-
virtuous cycle.
Yes,
Yes.
and it keeps going and going, we hope.
We hope.
Great discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And Andrew Beattie, I'd invite our iPolitics Live president to close out our discussion. Andrew?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, panel. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for today's show, and it's a bit regrettable because I think there were over 30 questions that were asked. But I want to tell you, for those questions that we didn't get to today, as those may have heard me say before, your questions were not for naught, okay? What we do with the questions is we take them back. We know that there's often a good story couched in a good question. And we'll take them back to our newsroom. We'll evaluate those questions there. We're going to assess them. We're going to explore them a little further and through our editorial meetings. And internally from the iPolitics Live team, we'll explore them even further and see if there's potential future fodder for other stories or other live events. So we look forward to addressing those. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating today. I also want to take a moment and thank our sponsor, Innovative Medicines Canada, for helping us bring forward this session today. Thank you, Pamela, and everybody with Innovative Medicines Canada for doing so. And just one last quick point of a housekeeping nature. We have some for future iPolitics live events. You can join us on June 20th. We're actually exploring the International Trade Forum, which is a little bit more in-depth, half-day issue, as we're looking into various issues affecting Canada and its position within global trade. We're dealing with NAFTA, CETA, and potentially some new bilateral agreements that we're going to have to be forced to explore. So it should be a very interesting afternoon with over 18 speakers now confirmed. And we'll be kicking off the event with the Honorable Andrew Leslie, who's been tasked, of course, with managing the Canada-U.S. relations on that afternoon. On June 22nd, we're going to be back here in Ottawa again for the exploration for a breakfast session as we explore what's involved in recreational cannabis, what we're going to, and how that, what the potential impacts for that. And then again, on June 28th, we finish off the spring session with a look on energy competitiveness. So for more information on all upcoming iPolitics live events, I would encourage you to look at the iPolitics website, register for these events, and we look forward to welcoming you and seeing you again at a future show. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.